Hi everyone, welcome to this presentation. A big thank you to Ali and Imbal for inviting me to speak here today and to the People and Plants workshop. I must say I feel a little underqualified to be introducing the collection since I only really worked with it for a few months, but hopefully I'll be able to provide a bit of a primer to what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting discussion surrounding the collection that will happen over the course of the workshop. I just want to give a bit of a disclaimer as well that I'm currently in the grips of COVID, so if I come across as a little out of breath, I apologise. But yeah, my aim here today is to just give a brief introduction to the Somali ethnobotanical collection that's held at the Powell-Cotton Museum, and then talk a little bit about the process of how we initially approached working with both the plant specimens and then the accompanying documentation and catalogues that went with it. I first came to be involved with working on the collection in 2019, when I was completing the ethnobotany masters at Kent. And the aim was to both kind of assess the state of the collection with this work and then also improve access to the materials by digitizing some of the information that was in the catalogues to enable further research later. And the hope was that I might be able to develop this into my master's thesis, but of course in 2020, COVID hits and the museum had to close. So this wasn't possible, but hopefully at least here I'll be able to kind of talk about these initial evaluations that we were able to undertake that can hopefully provide some useful jumping off points for discussions later on. So kind of firstly to provide some background about the collection and who collected it. The plant specimens are part of a wider ethnographic collection, which were collected by Diana Powell-Cotton in her travels in East Africa. She was the daughter of Percy Powell-Cotton, who's the founder of the museum, and she initially started traveling with her father in Sudan in 1934, before then breaking off on her own to travel to Mogadishu, which was the capital of what was then known as Italian Somalia. And then over the course of about 10 months, she traveled down the coast towards the Kenyan border, where she met with government officials and then also met with local communities. During this trip, she collected a large number of artifacts and objects. She also took a large number of photos and recorded in kind of quite good detail the information and things she'd learned from communities during her trip. She also kind of recorded the events of the trip in her own kind of personal diaries, which are also at the museum. And as a result of this trip, she returned with over 2,000 objects, the majority of which are now kept at the Powell-Cotton Museum, although a few were distributed to other UK museums like the British Museum and the Pitt Rivers. But from these 2,000 objects, about 145 are botanical specimens. And these were the focus of what we were looking at when we came to study the collection. So what is the collection? Well, when I came to look at it, it looked very much like it does here and what it still looks like today. So there are a few objects that are on display in the museum. So there are a few plant charms that were in the Somali gallery that were part of the collection, but as to be expected, most of the collection is in storage. And so they're in storage in these cardboard boxes with each individual specimen stored in plastic bags with some information from the catalogues that Diana recorded. The storage of the plants on display was really the first thing that we came to look at when we were assessing the collection. So it was also, on the one hand, a question of collections management. So was this a sustainable way of storing the plants? So they looked like this. They were either in small plastic bags or the bigger items were wrapped in paper. So was this a good long-term storage solution? But then on the other hand, it was also a question of kind of the nature of the collection in itself, of whether this was a good way of cataloguing these objects as a particular biocultural form of collection. And central to this was whether to consider the collection as one of part of a broader ethnographic collection and therefore treat each specimen as a broadly ethnographic object, or whether to try and distinguish the specimens as a different kind of collection from the other Somali materials and therefore kind of approach them in a more botanical way. And so one of the things we initially considered was whether it would be more appropriate to mount the specimen on herbarium sheets and therefore treat them kind of more explicitly as scientific botanical specimens. We found, however, that this didn't seem like the most appropriate approach for it, particularly as it came across very strongly in both how Diana had collected the objects and also reflected in the catalogue materials and documentations themselves that she had viewed this as an explicitly ethnobotanical collection rather than solely a collection that she'd made just for kind of botanical interest. And so the first thing was that It seems like Diana didn't really distinguish the plant specimens as separate from the other artifacts she collected. This is evidenced firstly in how she catalogued them. So in the numbering system of the objects, the ethnobotanical specimens are placed alongside all the other artifacts she collected. And they occur in the catalogue kind of interspersed with all the other things she collected, listed chronologically according to how she came across them. So she didn't distinguish the plant specimens as anything different from the other objects she collected. It's only much later when the objects are back in the museum that they emerge as a kind of separate collection and are treated as such. So this integration of the plant specimens into the rest of the ethnographic collection by Diana herself was something that we took into account when thinking about what kind of collection was this. Beyond kind of the placement of the botanical specimens by Diana within the broader Somali collections, one thing that was also clear from kind of looking at the physical nature of the plant specimens themselves is that Diana wasn't really interested in collecting whole plant specimens, as she perhaps would have done if she was interested only in their botanical kind of interest, if she was going to bring them back to Britain to, say, identify them through an institution like Kew, for example. She only really collected and maintained the bits of the plants that were economically useful. So we very rarely see kind of whole plants in the collection. They tend to just be the parts that she mentions in the catalogue as being used by people for certain things. So the vast majority of them, for example, are roots or leaves. There's also quite a lot of bark and some resin, but we don't see kind of whole plants being represented in this collection. We therefore decided that in terms of kind of the cataloguing the collection as it was probably most appropriate to keep it as it was without converting it into a more kind of scientific botanical cataloguing system. And in this sense, we kind of wanted to make sure that we maintained this sense of it being an ethnobotanical collection and a biocultural collection, rather than kind of reintegrating it into a kind of scientific botanical methodologies. And so having then looked at the physical side of the collection, I then delved into looking at the catalogues and kind of what information was there and how Diana had recorded it. So the documentation itself mostly consists of hand-typed catalogues, which she kind of has given each specimen a name, and then it's matched in the catalogue with then additional information about each artifact. So Diana made notes on the cultural group that each plant specimen came from and the district which they came from. She also always includes, well, almost always includes the local name of the plant. So she doesn't include scientific identifications in these catalogues, only local names. And she then provides a description of how they're used. So this generally includes which part of the plants they are used, which then corresponds to what is in the physical collection. And then how these plants are used. So in some cases, she gives information about how the plant is prepared, or if the plant is used in combination with other plants or other ingredients. She gives information about which diseases they might treat, or the specific kind of temporal context in which things might be used. So certain plants are only used for very specific times in either kind of the life of a person or in kind of seasonality, things like that. So she's very specific actually in how she kind of describes the plants. Occasionally, there's also some information about where the plant can be found locally, if it can be found locally, or if it's necessary to go and get this plant from somewhere like a local market and who the best person to buy it from might be. So she is quite detailed in terms of how the plants are procured, how they're used, and the kind of specific details of their use. Demographically, Diana names 13 cultural groups in these catalogues, coming from 19 different districts. At times, in terms of this kind of demographic data, she also includes additional information about where the sources of her information came from. For example, details of whether she gained the information from a man or a woman, and also what their cultural background was. For example, for a number of specimens, she describes that the information was gained from a man who was brought north as a child and then sold to the Shagal Somali. He is probably the most reliable of all the doctors. So she was kind of aware of these cultural complexities that were happening between local groups and the kind of intermingling of people between the different communities. So she did make a note of these things. She also makes a note as well of what language the local names are in, if she knows. And then also just something in terms of the catalogues that I think is interesting is the fact that in some cases, additional notes have been added after the original typing in handwriting, and there's multiple sets of handwriting on some of the catalogues. So there's kind of a suggestion that some work has been done on these collections historically, And they've been interpreted by kind of multiple sets of people since the collection has come to the museum. So I think there's an interesting story there to be said about kind of the life of this collection once it comes to the museum as well. And these suggestions tend to be kind of small details, so suggestions or corrections of locations. And then also someone has come in and given some suggestions for scientific identifications of some of the plants as well. But this is something that I wasn't really able to pursue much, but I just thought was really interesting. And so then kind of having looked at the catalogues in general, I then kind of looked more specifically at what kind of plant uses that she documents and kind of the nature of the plants that she has collected. So across the 145 specimens, over 40 different uses could be identified. The vast majority of the uses can be described as medicinal. And this might reflect kind of how plants are used in the communities in terms of that there is a focus on medicinal plant use over other types of uses. But I think it's also worth noting that this was a particular interest of Diana's as well. So she may have been particularly interested in documenting medicinal plant use because she was interested in medicine and later became a doctor. So it's difficult to tell whether the plants she collected are representative of actual use in community or whether it's also kind of reflecting the fact that she's interested in medicine. So this was primarily what she collected. But in terms of medicinal use, these range from cures for fever, headaches, there's cures for parasites and snake bites, and then things like skin diseases and digestive issues. Beyond kind of uses for humans, there's also some veterinary uses listed. So she talks about treatment for things like wounds or digestive issues in camel and cattle. And there's also some charms as well that are included with this kind of veterinary spirit of looking after your herd. So there's quite a kind of interesting range of medicinal use reflected in the collection. She didn't also only record medicinal plants, she also includes plants that are used for some other uses. So there's quite a lot of plants listed as being used for perfume or bodily decoration. And then other things kind of for more practical uses, like there's some plants that are used to wash clothes or some other plants that are used for earplugs, which I thought was quite fun. And then kind of the third element that emerges from the plant uses that she lists are plants that are described as charms. So plants that aren't used for kind of directly treating health issues or disease, but are rather to attract or prevent positive and negative forces in your life. So there are charms that are used to attract fish, to attract marriage partners, to attract new settlers to the village. And then also there's kind of the opposite, there's protection from a range of things that you don't want in your life. So there's a charm against crocodiles, there's a charm against smallpox and infidelity. And then there's kind of these more ambiguous charms. So one of my favorite is a charm which helps the user to have eloquence when presenting against an adversary in court, which I thought was really fun. And so kind of within these plant uses, which range across a broad kind of range of different uses, I just wanted to pick out a couple of things that I thought were particularly interesting about this collection. So one thing that really stands out within this kind of medicinal focus is the fact that there's a great kind of prevalence of plants that are used for female reproductive health and also for childcare. And apart from kind of the prevalence of this within the medicinal plants that she mentions, it's kind of almost half, I think, plants are related to related to female reproductive health within this medicinal plant category, is the fact that the detail that she goes into with the plants and the kind of the detail of how the plants are used is extremely specific and extremely detailed. It's not just plants that are used kind of for general health in pregnancy or for generally helping childbirth. She's very specific in how she details each plant. So for example, several plants are listed as being used for treating blood loss, but the plants that are listed are very specific in their use. So for example, one described as being called loatu is used to treat excessive or painful bleeding during menstruation, but another, digdor, is not used for menstruation, but is used for bleeding during the 2nd to 4th months of pregnancy. There's another plant, masalanche, which is taken to treat blood during childbirth, but not after childbirth, which is another plant called kuka, which is used to clear out blood after childbirth. So I think this specificity of plant use is really interesting, and I think really shows the significance of this collection of providing these kind of really detailed descriptions of how plants are being used by communities at this time. Equally, in addition to this kind of emphasis on female reproductive health, there's also an emphasis on treatment for children and childcare. And this is equally specific as with the female reproductive health plants. So for example, there's plants used to treat babies crying. There's also plants for the treatment of malaria, smallpox, and just for general injuries. And one of the most frequently mentioned is an ailment that's caused by a child who was passed over by an aberdeen bird. And a number of plants are described as either being used to prevent, diagnose, or treat this illness. And Diana doesn't actually provide a description of what this bird is, but she does make a note of the fact that being passed over by this bird often causes a severe illness and death. So it makes sense that this would have been highly representative in plant use in the community if it's such a severe disease affecting children. And I think some of the interesting questions that emerge from this emphasis within the medicinal plants is one, Diana's position as someone who is recording this information. So as a female traveller, did she have access to this information more so than perhaps a male traveller did? We don't necessarily know, but I think that's an interesting question. And then also in terms of the information that we have about where she got this knowledge from, there's some interesting aspects to kind of how accessible this knowledge was across the communities. For example, for many of the plants that are used for female reproductive health, the source of this information seems to have come from a man. So there's a suggestion that this knowledge was freely accessible within communities, or at least it wasn't particularly gendered or only accessible to women. But this is something that I think really deserves more time being put into it, and something I wasn't obviously able to do with the time I had with the collection, but was definitely something that kind of flagged up to me as a really interesting thing that deserved further research. And then kind of lastly from the catalogues, the other thing that I think was really interesting and that kind of deserves more engagement is the fact that in the documentation, not only are kind of health and disease issues presented in terms of kind of Western scientific understandings of disease as would have been understood at the time in Britain, but also Diana makes notes of ailments in terms of how they're understood and conceived by local communities. So she makes a note of a number of illnesses and ailments in local languages. And then she also provides kind of the perspectives of communities of how they understand and treat these illnesses. These additional notes I think are interesting, not only because they demonstrate, I guess, that Diana was interested in this, but also I think the additional information that she provides with them gives a kind of really interesting insight into the relationships between communities and health in Somalia at this time. So her additional notes not only list information given by her Indigenous informants, but also she lists the perspectives on these diseases by local Italian government officials. So this archive, I think, therefore has the potential to provide some really information about the relationships between local communities and the colonial Italian presence at the time through this particular lens of health and disease. And again, was something I was not able to delve into further, but I think was just something I wanted to flag as an interesting aspect of the collection that I think could really be delved into further. And then lastly, the kind of initial thing that we looked at was doing some kind of very initial explorations of seeing if we could identify the plants in the collection scientifically. And so this was done, as I said, Diana never actually mentions any scientific identifications or scientific names in her catalogues. Anything that's there has been added subsequently. But she does list local names. So what we were kind of able to do initially was find ethnobotanical studies that had been done of the regions that she had visited and see if any of the local names matched up to what was found by these studies. And so we were able to kind of give a few speculative identifications of what we think things might have been. But one of the things we talked about that we weren't able to do just because of time limitations and kind of resource limitations were that it might be possible to send off samples to something like DNA metabarcoding, which would give more positive species identifications, which could then be used for further research. But yeah, so those were kind of the initial things I found with working for the collection. As I said, I think it's a really significant collection, that there's a lot of work to be done with it. And definitely there were a lot of areas that I wasn't able to cover, but there's definitely kind of a lot more to be done with it. And so, yeah, these were kind of the three areas I think that could really be taken further with it. So obviously doing more work with identifications, kind of perhaps comparing collections. If there are other economic botany collections that include Somali materials, that would be interesting. And then kind of more comprehensive review of East African ethnobotanical literature would be needed, as well as perhaps additional identification processes. The archival materials, I think there's a lot more potential to look at there, particularly delving into Diana's diaries, and the photographic archives, I think, could really provide a more kind of rich context to how this information was provided, and kind of Diana's particular relationship with communities. I'd just like to signpost here as well to a really interesting blog post that was written by Emma Watson as part of the Making African Connections project, where she studied Diana's diaries during her Angola trip, which was a bit later in 1937, but she kind of made a note of the fact that Diana often had quite a difficult and problematic relationship with communities, and that her presence there was often quite kind of colonial and extractive. And so I think kind of thinking about this context of how she got the specimens and also got the knowledge that she received from communities, I think we need to think of in quite a kind of critical lens, which I think is particularly kind of pertinent for thinking about ethnobotanical collections today and things like biopiracy. And then thirdly, obviously, the thing that was missing from all the work I did, but which I know is continuing now with the Powell-Cotton, and there's some really brilliant projects going ahead, like the Nomad project, is thinking about how this collection could relate to things like community engagement. So sharing the collection, sharing the photos and the catalogues and the knowledge there with communities, both in Somalia and elsewhere in diaspora communities. And also then thinking about how this knowledge might be useful for communities, but also perhaps also then comparing how plant use is being used by communities today. So these are all things that I think we'll, I'm sure, be able to delve into later this afternoon. And yeah, I'm really excited to see how this work goes ahead and how it can be further engaged with, because yeah, as I said, I think it's a really important and significant collection that has a lot of potential for interesting research. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.